And there we would all stay, hanging on the words that would fall from my grandmother's lip when she brought us back her report of the enemy, as though there had been some uncertainty among a vast number of possible invaders. And then soon after, my grandfather would say, "I can hear Swann's voice." And indeed, one could tell him only by his voice, for it was difficult to make out his face with its arched nose and green eyes, under a high forehead fringed with blonde, almost red hair, dressed in the Bresson style, because in the garden we used as little light as possible so as not to attract mosquitoes, and I would slip away as though not going for anything in particular to tell them to bring out the syrups. My grandmother made a great point, thinking it nicer of their not being allowed to seem anything out of the ordinary, and for visitors only. Although a far younger man, Monsieur Swann was very much attached to my grandfather, who had been a close friend of Swann's father, an excellent but eccentric man, in whom the least little thing would, it seemed, often check the flow of his spirits and divert the current of his thoughts. Several times in the course of a year, I would hear my grandfather tell at table the story, which never varied, of the behavior of Monsieur Swann the elder on the death of his wife, by whose bedside he had watched day and night. My grandfather, who had not seen him for a long time, hastened to join him at the Swann's family property on the outskirts of Cambrai, and managed to entice him for a moment, weeping profusely, out of the room where she lay dead. So that he would not be present when the body was laid in its coffin. They took a turn or two in the park, where there was a little sunshine. Suddenly, Monsieur Swann seized my grandfather by the arm and cried, "Oh, my dear old friend, how fortunate we are to be walking here together in such fine weather. Don't you see how pretty they are, all these trees, my hawthorns, and my new pond, on which you have never congratulated me? You look down in the dumps. Don't you feel this little breeze? Ah, whatever you may say, it's good to be alive all the same, my dear Amédée." And then abruptly the memory of his dead wife returned to him, and probably thinking it too complicated to inquire into how, at such a time, he could have allowed himself to be carried away by an impulse of happiness, he confided himself to a gesture that he had habitually employed whenever any perplexing question came into his mind. That is, he passed his hand across his forehead, dried his eyes, and wiped his glasses. And he could never be consoled for the loss of his wife, but used to say to my grandfather during the 2 years by which he survived her, "It's a funny thing now. I very often think of my poor wife, but I cannot think of her very much at any one time. Often, but a little at a time, like poor old Swann, became one of my grandfather's favorite phrases, which he would apply to all kinds of things. And I would have assumed that this father of Swann's had been a monster if my grandfather, whom I regarded as a better judge than myself, and whose word was my law, and often led me in the long run to pardon offenses I would have been inclined to condemn, had not gone on to exclaim, "But after all, he had a heart of gold." For many years, and especially before his marriage, when Monsieur Swann the younger came often to see them at Cambrai, my great-aunt and grandparents never suspected that he had entirely ceased to live in the kind of society that his family had frequented, or that, under the sort of incognito that the name of Swann gave him among us, they were harboring, with complete innocence of a family of honest innkeepers who have in their midst some distinguished bandit and never know it, one of the most elegant members of the Jockey Club, a particular friend of the Comte de Paris and of the Prince of Wales, and one of the men most sought after in the aristocratic world of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. Our utter ignorance of the brilliant part that Swann was playing in the world of high society was, of course, due in part to his own reserve and discretion, but also to the fact that middle-class people in those days took what was almost a Hindu view of society, which they held to consist of sharply defined castes, so that everyone at his birth was found himself called to that station in life that his parents already occupied, and nothing, except the chance of a brilliant career or a fortunate marriage, could extract you from that station or admit you to a superior caste. Monsieur Swann, the father, had been a stockbroker, and so young Swann found himself immured for life in a caste where one's fortune, as in a list of taxpayers, varied between such and such limits of income. We knew the people with whom his father had associated, and so we knew his own associates, the people with whom he was in a position to mix. If he knew other people besides, those were youthful acquaintances on whom the old friends of the family, like my relatives, shut their eyes all the more good-naturedly because Swann himself, after the death of his parents, still came most faithfully to see us. But we would have been ready to wager that the people outside our acquaintance whom Swann knew were of the sort to whom he would not have dared to raise his hat had he met them while he was walking with us. Had there been such a thing as a determination to apply to Swann a social coefficient peculiar to himself, a distinct from all the other sons of stockbrokers in his father's position, his coefficient would have been rather lower than theirs, because leading a very simple life and having always had a craze for antiques and pictures, he now lived and piled up his collection in an old mansion that my grandmother longed to visit, but that stood on the Quai d'Orléans, a neighborhood in which my great-aunt thought it most degrading to live. "Are you really a connoisseur now?" she would say to him. "I ask for your own sake, as you are likely to have fakes palmed off on you by the dealers," for she did not, in fact, endow him with any critical faculty, and had no great opinion of the intelligence of a man who in conversation would avoid serious topics, and showed a very dull preciseness, not only when he gave us kitchen recipes, going into the most minute details, but even when my grandmother's sisters were talking to him about art. When challenged by them to give an opinion, or to express his admiration for some picture, he would remain almost impolitely silent, and would then make amends by furnishing, if he could, some fact or other about the museum in which the picture was hung, or the date at which it had been painted. But as a rule, he would content himself with trying to amuse us by telling us the story of his latest adventure. And he would have a new story for us on every occasion, with someone whom we ourselves knew, such as the Cambrai pharmacist, or our cook, or our coachman. These stories certainly used to make my great-aunt laugh, but she could never tell whether that was on account of the absurd parts which Swann invariably made himself play in the adventures, or of the wit that he showed in telling us of them. "It is easy to see that you are a real character, Monsieur Swann." As she was the only member of our family who could be described as a trifle common, she would always take care to remark to strangers, when Swann was mentioned, that he could easily, if he had wished to, have lived in the Boulevard Haussmann, or the Avenue de l'Opéra, and that he was the son of old Monsieur Swann, who must have left him 4 or 5 million francs. But that it was a whim of his, a whim which, moreover, she thought was bound to amuse other people, so much that in Paris, when Monsieur Swann called on New Year's Day, bringing her a little packet of marrons glacés, she never failed, if there were guests in the room, to say to him, "Well, Monsieur Swann, do you still live next door to the wine depot, so as to be sure of not missing your train when you go to Lyon?" And she would peep out of the corner of her eye over her lorgnon at the other visitors. But if anyone had suggested to my aunt that this Swann, who in his capacity as the son of old Monsieur Swann was fully qualified to be received by any of the upper middle class, the most respected notaries and lawyers of Paris, though he was perhaps a trifle inclined to let this hereditary privilege go into abeyance, had another almost secret existence of a wholly different kind, that when he left our house in Paris, saying that he must go home to bed, he would no sooner have turned the corner than he would stop, retrace his steps, and be off to some drawing room on whose, like no stockbroker or associate of stockbrokers had ever set eyes. That would have seemed to my aunt as extraordinary as, to a woman of wider reading, the thought of being herself on terms of intimacy with Aristeas, of knowing that he would, when he had finished his conversation with her, plunge deep into the realms of Thetis, into an empire veiled from mortal eyes, in which Virgil depicts him as being received with open arms, or to be content with an image more likely to have occurred to her, for she had seen it painted on the plates we had used for petit foie at Cambrai, of having had to dinner with Ali Baba, who, as soon as he found himself alone and unobserved, would make his way into the cave, resplendent with its unsuspected treasures.